Good evening and welcome to Breaking Ground. I wish I could see all of you out there, not least in this moment of profound reckoning, grief, righteous anger, weariness, shock, conviction, fear, impatience, loss, and so many more emotions and headspaces all jostling in a big vat of a year we'll probably just always remember as 2020. But we are separated by the screen and actually hidden from each other in all of our particularities, different life experiences, cultural backgrounds, dispositions and personalities, callings, loyalties, geography, material wants and needs or lack thereof, health conditions, wounds, the list goes on and on. And it is precisely in this separated, multi-webbed chasm of at once wonderful difference and tragic fracture that I want to invite you to pause, to look with courage down into the very real rivets that exist between each of us, to try to notice and take stock of the weeds growing there, some of which are choking us, and to bend down, identify them, pluck them up and toss them away. And then having done that, to look up at one another, standing around the cleared space, able to till the soil and discuss and debate what we should plant and build, hopefully together. Breaking Ground and this very first event is first and foremost an act of hope. In the midst of all that has disrupted the world this year due to COVID-19, and in the midst of all that's gathered steam in the wake of George Floyd's death last week, much of it simply a mass exclamation point on a cancerous root of a lie that has spread for centuries, namely that one race is superior to another and that human value can somehow be measured along a man-made hierarchy. In the swirl of all of this, we are here to take stock, to try to see as clearly as we can, to learn from one another, to listen and to share, to stake a claim on the good and the true and the beautiful, and to try to build something different than what we've had yet together. A society that might order its loves a little differently than the consumeristic individualism so many of us are tired of. A society that understands fundamentally that not only does every person matter, which is actually a bit of a low bar, but that we need each other, each one of us, existentially. The community is going to be the content over the next year, which is not to say we don't hope to inspire top-notch ideas or show-stopping arguments. Quite the contrary. But I've come to believe that persons have to precede policies. Souls just have to precede dogma. Men and women, thinkers and doers, children, and all the things that hold us together peaceably don't exist first as words on a page. They exist first in relation to one another, person to person, I and thou. And here at Breaking Ground, we believe that that neighborly ground of reality is founded on the preceding biblical commandment: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And that these two loves are mysteriously in a dance that gets better and richer the more you choose to submit to it. Part of this dance we hope to illuminate in the year ahead through Breaking Ground's content and events, much of it commissioned, some of it curated, and part of it we simply just want to embody. This project has already been strengthened from the beginning by a collaborative spirit. My own Comment magazine, founded by Cardis, a Canadian think tank committed to sowing the conditions for a flourishing society, illuminated by rigorous research and 2,000 years of Christian social thought, is honored to be linking arms with the widely beloved Plough Quarterly of Bruderhof roots and the intellectually robust Davenon Institute, and now also nearly a dozen new affiliates whose names you'll find on our site, just launched an hour ago. I am personally experiencing the joy of working with a new colleague, the brilliant and passionate Susanna Black, who keeps me on my toes and challenges my inchoate instincts, as well as Brian Brown of the Anselm Society. Heidi Deddens comes with me from Comment, our Renaissance managing editor, and has brought endless energy and detailed good cheer to the site we've unveiled just literally in the last hour. I want to thank all of them, and you'll hear more from them directly in the future. We welcome more collaborators and affiliates, and we'll be establishing a process in the next week that allows for regular communication and editorial input. The hope is to swell into a multi-part choir whose song may at times sound tense and discordant, especially as the church herself is no stranger to the fractures of our broader society, but at other times reconciled, I hope, into layered harmony, moving everyone watching to cheers, maybe, then to their feet, and then to walking and serving and building. So now let me get to the real reason you're here. Our starting community. Candace Vogler, Dante Stewart, and Pancho Argüelles are three very different people in some senses and did not know each other before a week ago. Candace comes to us from the philosophy department at the University of Chicago, a renowned ethicist and committed teacher. Dante is a budding writer and speaker whose own intellectual and theological journey is a road punctuated by discernment, honesty, and courage. And Pancho is a friend whose work alongside men and women that have emigrated to the US and experienced severe spinal cord injuries is daily, sensitive, spiritually alive, and committed to accompanying those who suffer often out of view. I've asked each of them to share of themselves in this brief hour and help define what is at stake as we navigate this unusually uncertain time of COVID-19, of the pain of this last week, so that breaking ground might begin from a place of realism, even if partial. So let's begin. We're gonna have about a half hour of discussion panelists to panelists, and then open this up to questions from the audience, which you can feel free to drop in the chat, and Susanna will select a healthy sampling for me to ask them. So Pancho, Candace, and Dante, hi, and thank you again for coming. On the one hand, this pandemic and then the events of the last 10 days suggest a country plunged into crisis. And at the same time, it's become increasingly clear that COVID-19 has revealed more than it's catalyzed, as has the video capturing George Floyd's death and the uprising and leadership choices since just in the last week. Insofar as every crisis presents an opportunity, how would you articulate the opportunity in this one, layered and complicated though it is? What is the core nature of it, the hope of it even? And I'll ask you, Candace, to begin.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your inaugural event. I mean, the thing that has been most striking to me about the protest, the peaceable and not so peaceable protests over the past several days, has been that it's allowed us to open up discussion of common good and egalitarianism in a way I don't remember ever happening before. I think that in my community, at least, people have been willing to treat occasional sporadic violence and some damage to some shops and some broken windows as a distraction from an actually shared and emerging and newly articulated commitment to broad understanding of justice and civil rights. I've never seen anything like it. It looks to me like there is such broad-based willingness to open a discussion about the place of race in the United States, at least, and not just in the United States. I mean, Matt Hancock ended his COVID-19 update in the UK with the words Black Lives Matter, and we haven't paid sufficiently close attention to that after revealing the incredible statistics on coronavirus infections and mortality in the UK, which are, like here, statistics that show a racial divide right at the heart of the pandemic as it's been experienced there. So it's sort of to be able to use these terrible scenes of violence and injustice as a way of opening a broad discussion about systematic racialized injustice is incredibly powerful. And the fact that there's a core understanding that what we have to be about is a common good that actually can be shared across very many differences and across political parties and across other things. It's like the first really powerful and self-consciously collective moment I've seen since the lockdown started a number of weeks ago. I mean, sporadic help, sporadic checking in, sporadic attempts to be with neighbors and stuff as best we can with physical distancing, like to not let physical distancing mean social distancing. I've seen that. But to actually see this groundswell of feeling, not just here, but in places like Berlin and London and Paris, and in Australia and New Zealand, where people are willing to take up the awful, intolerable treatment of Black people. I mean, the police brutality toward Black people in the United States as an occasion to bring it to their places and to open up discussions about the shape those challenges take in their places. That's unbelievable. And it allows for a discussion of common good that I would not have anticipated. And I think even when people have dramatically different takes on what's occurring, what you hear is very different understandings of the goods that are at stake at this particular moment. And the fact that even the harsh, critical, awful ones calling for law and order and stuff, are at least trying to see a social good somewhere, comes closer to producing the possibility of common ground than I've seen in a very long time. So I'm actually very hopeful that, this hideous sin at the core of culture in this part of the world, at least, and many parts of the world, could actually be articulated and produce the possibility of building a sustainable and sustaining community in a way that we haven't seen.
Thank you, Candace. Dante, I'm going to hand you the mic.
So, in some sense, what opportunity do I see in this moment? It's, I guess the most important thing is kind of to navigate the social location that I'm coming from, being a Black millennial in America. One of the things I'm seeing right now as opportunity is I want to pick it back on Professor Vogler, where she said, in some sense, a revolutionary spirit is becoming widespread. And I think, as many people saw in the 70s, there is this kind of practice of solidarity that is, in some sense, changing, where I don't even know in recent time if we've seen on such a global scale this sense of global solidarity. Now, in the past, many of the global protests was in some sense as a kind of question of America and American dominance and the loss of a type of global community and multilateralism, and the retreat to kind of a certain type of politics that is nationalist in its orientation. And right now, in this protest that's, in some sense surprising, is that it is not simply a protest of America, but it's particularly a protest for Black lives. Right now, there is a global proclamation that Black lives matter. And as I think about this moment, particularly being a young Black millennial, part of me, in some sense, would say, I don't know if I'm necessarily hopeful in this moment, because of, or in some sense, I would reimagine the language of hope. only in a sense of, I would say, maybe for white people in this society, there is a, in some sense, hopeful nature of this moment, because many white people in a society is getting it, or they're willing in some sense to use the language of Paul Tillich, they're having the courage to be in this moment, to be and to risk. But, being Black in this moment is kind of, it's the question of how does one become so hopeful in a society that's so anti-Black? Yeah. And so reimagining the language of hope in this moment in an anti-Black world, in some sense, forces me to realize that in some sense, if there is the language of hope for this moment, then the hope is not in some sense the dream. The hope is in the struggle. And so I kind of, now, as I think about Martin Luther King's life, the last 3 years of his life, when I look at where do we go from here, and in this moment, I think in some sense, if hope is in the struggle, then the hope lies in this collective ethic of a revolution of value. That in this American society, people are now, in some sense, realizing that Black life in America is worth loving and worth fighting for. But we're also seeing how deeply steep this white supremacist understanding or logic of value, this distinction of value in a society where, a white person could, in some sense, swing weapons at a cop, but a Black person, simply by being, has the life sucked out of them in very public ways. And so in some sense, the revolution of value that's taking place right now, if I had to communicate any sense of hope, it's the hope that the voice of Black rage is finally moving into the mainstream, rather than being seen as, a radical alternative that must be suppressed. And particularly to the millennial and Gen Z reality, I think, this courage, this courageous nature to put one's body, one's life, one's credibility, one's, in some sense, ideology, and, one's vision of what, the future should look like on the line. I am incredibly proud in this moment to say that we, as one of my friends would say, we out here. We young people, we are out here. We are on the streets. We're in politics. We're in religion. We're writing. We are preaching. We are protesting. We're doing everything in hopes of us having a better world than that came before us, to finally realize that love, power, and justice can be a shaping reality.
Thank you. Pancho, what do you think? Hope in the struggle?
Well, amen.
Look at living hope behind you.
Yes, those were powerful words from my brother and my sister there. And hope is a central element of the everyday work I do with the organization. I work with the Living Hope Wheelchair Association, which is formed by immigrants who suffer spinal cord injuries, other kind of illnesses, and most of them undocumented immigrants who face daily this message from a society that tells them, your body is broken, you cannot produce for me anymore, then your pain, your life is not really valuable to me. And within the larger immigrant community, this notion that a lot of what we were living in what was normal included elements that became more democratically distributed with the pandemic, like that notion of being afraid of going out in the street, which is an experience that people of color, Black people, Latinos, Native Americans experience every day. Like if I go to the store and I find the grown police, the grown apple that inhabits one of those rotten barrels, I might not make it back or I will be deported. This experience of grieving from afar, of knowing your mama, your grandma is dying and you cannot be there to hug her, is an everyday reality for immigrants, undocumented immigrants. refugees. So I think that part of what we're experiencing is this collective vulnerability that can be a door to fear and to let our lizard brain take over. And we know that we have devolved our democracy into kind of a lizard brain democracy in the past few years, that there is a science to activate that part of the brain that is all about fear and survival, and to deactivate that parts that have to do with empathy, compassion, rationality. And we are risking our life as a democracy, but even as a species worldwide, because we have let our democracies devolve into this kind of lizard brain based on fear. So hope it's a powerful word that I get the privilege of learning and relearning every day with my compañeras from Living Hope. And they confirm something that I learned when I worked in Chiapas in southern Mexico with Guatemalan refugees who survived the genocide that the Guatemalan army, supported by the US government, conducted there in the 70s and 80s, or in Nicaragua after the war, or in different moments when I have been facing these kind of disastrous conditions that are not natural but are common. They confirm the notion that hope is a function of memory. We can have hope because we can remember. We can put together those notions that help us get through the big trials and tribulations. One thing that we were saying in a recent conversation with immigrant rights organizations around the US South was trying to make sense of this time and exploring possibilities for mutual aid, was like, we need to take a deep breath and not let to be overwhelmed, and remember and connect to hope, and see that in these apocalyptic times, to remember that it's not our first apocalypse. It's not the first time that a big event has revealed the truth of the system and also revealed the truth about us. Another way to put it is, this is not the first desert we crossed, but we have never crossed a desert quite like this. And for immigrants, that's actual literal. For the Central American migrants who cross Mexico and then walk through the desert, they know what it is to have God's presence in your life, holding your hand as you are navigating that line of life and death. And for me, a great opportunity in these times is for the communities of faith, for churches, and in general for societies, to open ourselves to really be taught and be revealed the truth of the gospel from those who have this powerful experience of God being close to them in their suffering. Black people who have been facing this brutal violence and small and big ways of racism, those kids who are out there breaking the police line and putting their bodies, those young people, allies who get themselves between them and the police, this social conversion, this opportunity to a conversion that is humbling, that is transformative. It's an opportunity for some way, a way of healing that is centered on reconciliation and relation and reparations of damage. Not this fluffy healing that politicians start throwing around after a mass shooting happens, but a healing that is centered on what I learned from Cassandra Thomas. Healing is recovering power and control. So we as a society can try to recover power and control over those feelings of fear and distrust and rage and superiority. If this country is gonna heal, it's gonna have to really get head on white supremacy. How do you heal from white supremacy? From this dehumanization, alienation of the other, no, of immigrants, violence against women. That has to do with recovering power and control, not just the oppressor on their capacity to do damage, but the people suffering on our capacity to uphold our dignity in community.
Yeah. Pancho, what would you say, and actually any of you can answer this, but I'll direct it to you first, Pancho. And in some ways it's embedded in what each of you has said, but how would you locate and articulate sort of, if there, I'm, you know, I've lived in DC off and on for the last 15 years, and it's a city that has a lot of prognosticators and pundits and a lot of people diagnosing the problems from on high, right? And so we have a lot of isms floating around, fragmentation, or that's a shun, but, you know, tribalism, these sort of words get thrown around, and so, on my view, sometimes vaguely and often misused or sort of not specified. I'm curious if you could locate one core idea that kind of lies at what we might even call the rot of sort of our society at this moment, or the sickness, or the malaise. How would you articulate that? I would probably say it's probably a false idea that's causing that, but you can, I'll let you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'm just curious how you would name that. If there is such a thing as one. I'm sure everything is related, but.
It's all related. I had to choose one. I will say white supremacy.
Okay.
The centrality of the value of white lives over other lives, expressed, for instance, in the absurdity of counting how many Americans, and when you know that when mainstream voices say American, they mean white, and we count how many Americans die in Iraq, but we don't count how many Iraqi civilians in the hundreds of thousands die. Would also apply here is this notion of what is valuable, what is urgent when showing up to an emergency room. Yeah, but there are others that are based on our capacity to ignore things.
Yeah. Go ahead, Candace, did I hear you? No, I didn't hear you, you're muted. Dante, coming off of that, another way I would articulate that, and it's sort of referencing something you said, this revolution of value. So, you know, another way of articulating white supremacy is just this false notion, this hierarchy of human value that puts some on top of others.
Yes.
And that has been certainly in the US from the beginning, and I would argue sort of as Candace said, has happened in different ways all over the world and is a timeless human sin, deep sin, and it's had a particular vengeance here. If you could articulate a principle or even a poem or embodied sort of action that you have seen or that has been a part of your own experience that sort of serves as a kind of key to help a community of people strip and or sort of strip away and repent of some of these, you know, false ideas, sort of release some of their power, how would you describe like what that key is? And it's not probably one thing.
No, that's okay. Yeah, that's okay. I want to go back to what Pancho said. I think, you know, Brother Pancho is actually hitting on something that's actually incredibly important as we even navigate this society, this kind of, as he says, this apocalyptic moment right now. This idea of what Eddie Glaude in Democracy in Black, who's a professor of African American Studies in the Religion Department at Princeton University, would call the value gap in his book, Democracy in Black. And what he says is, you know, many people, when they try and understand this language of white supremacy, many of them think that, you know, it's, you know, you will not replace us in Charlottesville, or, you know, militia with AR-15s, or et cetera, et cetera. And yes, that is indeed, you know, that one, you know, could be white and male with an AR-15 and protesting in very public ways, not only in front of the law, but actually against the law, and not receive any type of repercussions, but be rewarded by embodying this narrative of difference, or whatnot. They're rewarded as good people. But you got protesters who are Black and, you know, in some sense, you know, protesting for their value in a very, you know, collective, progressive, democratic grassroots coalition of multiracial people, and they get called thugs. And so in some sense, you know, right now, for me at least, we have to navigate the society in the public sphere asking this question. And I think this is a very important question for us to be navigating in public. Is America a country with racism, or is America fundamentally a racist country? And as I think about this kind of navigation of race in America and language of white supremacy and the value gap, we have to, I think, navigate that, you know, race in this world has been a defining, a dehumanizing, and destructive and deadly reality. And so as we think about, you know, this moment, is this moment simply saying, you know, you have each individual acts of racism, of public bigotry, as many people have thought, or is this society and its structures and its policies and its practices, what and whom it chooses to value, is it a fundamentally racist nation? I would say that it is. And so the moment right now for us, what we need right now is not simply, you know, this principle, as many people are calling for, this principle of, you know, a fetishized Martin Luther King of we need to come together and have unity, whatnot. America, we don't have a reconciliation problem. America has a racist problem that has racial habits deeply embedded into our society that values white lives over Black lives. And so I would say for this moment, for me, as I wrote in a recent essay, that, you know, being Black in an anti-Black world today, for me, becomes the greatest moral, political, and social task. That this kind of navigation of Black rage becomes the greatest spiritual virtue and moral obligation and political practice, because rage, as it relates to us as Black people in this society, it has oftentimes been seen as radical. And indeed it is. It is the calls for Black rage and Black power in this moment is opposite than a society that calls for white power and white supremacy. White power wants dominance. Black power and Black rage wants dignity. And so right now, rage in this moment for me has been, you know, a spiritual virtue that wakes us up out of our illusion that this society is the way that it should be. It wakes us up out of this illusion that Black lives don't matter. And so when we see the globe stand in solidarity in this moment, saying that Black lives matter, we can say that that is a public expression of a theological commitment and truth that Black lives matter to God. And so as I think about this moment, and I think about, you know, as a writer and a preacher, communicating the legitimacy of a Black rage that wakes us up out of our illusion and communicates a vision of revolution, a revolution of value, as Martin Luther King would say, from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society that, like I said earlier, believes Black people are worth fighting for and loving, and that we as Black people are not second-class citizens. We don't need a society where we are exploited or disrespected, but we need a society where Black power becomes a living reality. And many people have thought that, you know, revolution of value is a point. It is not a point. A revolution of value that is guided by a certain type of Black rage, communicated through a long history of the Black freedom struggle, as it was rooted in political philosophy, moral vision, and this kind of spiritual communication. This language, in some sense, bridges our ideals of what should be and a practice of a type of embodied hope of what we can become. And so now in this moment, what I say is that one of the most important principles is asking ourselves, how do we respond to Black rage in a society that justifies and rewards Black death?
Thank you. Candace, you've thought a lot about virtue in your life and in your work. I'm curious if you could respond both to this notion, not so much responding to the notion of Black rage as a spiritual virtue, but that in the broader context of how these virtues and behaviors get shaped and expressed right now, as insofar as, frankly, part of breaking ground, part of this conversation is the hope is to try to re-narrate a better common life together. And that can happen in sometimes very fractious ways, and sometimes that can happen, there can be sort of resolution, maybe the wrong word, but a common life together ideally is like deeply honest. And as a teacher in a classroom for many years now, and as someone who's kind of been all over the world, who's studied philosophers, you know, throughout the Western canon and beyond, I'm curious if you could sort of help us get a little more practical when it comes to kind of what you see as the institutions, if we're going to use that word, or sort of forms and mediums. Like I'll just say, like right now, there's a lot of, especially post, you know, on the backs and in the middle of COVID, we have sort of two main ways of, it seems like, of expressing ourselves. One is on the streets, and one is through a screen or through a sort of media platform. And those are powerful, but they're also, they're not necessarily, there's also a lot of other ways. And so I'm just sort of curious, as you think about performative versus formative, how, just sort of some thoughts on kind of models of engagement that you have found to be productive in a pluralistic, diverse society.
One of the biggest learning experiences for me was volunteering for very many years with an organization here on the south side of Chicago under the leadership of people who had come up through the Black Panther Party. And one of the most important aspects of the experience was to be under the leadership of these people. Not to be sort of going into the neighborhood with some idea that I knew what people needed, but going into the neighborhood with some sense of the kind of resources I might have that they might lack, and asking how those could be put to use in a powerful and helpful way. So back when I started the work, one of the things that was clear was that almost every family had legal trouble. They all had relatives in prison, often people who shouldn't have been in prison at all. But I think I'm not in favor of putting people in cages generally. But so I had access to this amazing law library at the university, and I had access to these reference librarians. And I could just walk in there and say, here's a problem. How can you use the legal system to try to address it? And use those resources that I had in virtue of being at the University of Chicago on the faculty. Similarly, letterhead, University of Chicago letterhead. I could get people to actually meet with their constituents by writing letter after letter after letter on university letterhead. And people who were avoiding their elected officials, who were avoiding their own constituents, actually phoning me at my home and saying, who the hell are you? You know, writing to me like this. To learn, for me as a white person trying to live in solidarity with other people, to have an opportunity to learn from those people is to have an opportunity to unlearn all of the habits, the deep cultural and other habits that are part of internalized whiteness and that make me ashamed of being white a lot of the time. I think that's just empirical. Like you look at what happens when we show up somewhere, awful shit happens when we, sorry for the language, terrible things happen when we show up someplace. People suffer, people are exploited, people die. That's what it's like when people who look like me show up someplace where there haven't been people who look like me before, historically. And to be aware and alive to that history, to realize that I can't know what it's like to be on the other side of that history, but I have opportunities these days to actually listen and learn from people who are on the other side, to take direction and to take leadership. And so for me, part of the real potency of Black Rage is the potency to both carry that experience and articulate that experience and help figure out how to combine resources in a way that does things large and small. I think white supremacy isn't the name of a belief or an attitude. It's the name of a whole cultural way of life. And the problem is figuring out how to break that. And the easiest, for me, the thing that's tremendously important is to realize that people who aren't on the suffering edge of that don't even recognize the kinds of things that they can simply take for granted. And to learn how to dismantle some of the attitudes is to learn a different way of being with your neighbors. And it's to actually recognize who your neighbors are. Your neighbors are people who are bringing you a kind of experience that you don't have, and a kind of pain, and I mean, sometimes cynicism. I mean, it's like I use the language of hope, but I've also read a lot of history enough to know that what you should experience and expect is another long, hard slog to just try to get very basic things in place. Something as basic as no more chokeholds, right? I mean, way before you get to maybe we shouldn't be putting humans in cages. So for me, as both a teacher and a learner, one of the most important things is to figure out how to make the space to hear other voices enough so that your own way of recognizing the patterns around you can actually be disrupted. And you can learn to pay attention to different things. You can learn to take different things as the most important things around you, and gradually try to remove some of the stain that comes of having skin like ours.
Yeah. Thank you. Dante and Pancho, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. Either of you?
Yeah, and this is so good. I wish we could just camp here and stay for a while. I think we are living a time of acknowledgement and recognition, which are in some way kind of learning or theory words to express what conversion is. Because I think that we got to this crisis in part because our society, our very limited democracy, where a lot of people have never really have access to that democracy, which is another pernicious idea that I think does a lot of damage to the United States. This idea of American exceptionalism and the fact that it's like this real democracy, shining city on a hill. This shining city on a hill for some is the post-apocalyptic reality for Native Americans. Mm-hmm. And we have to develop cognitive mechanisms to ignore a lot of things. The more privilege I have, the more I have to develop mechanisms to ignore realities. Like me as a male, I have to develop mechanisms to ignore the way patriarchy really serves to propel me and oppresses women around me. And that's essential to the system, and it's really entrenched with white supremacy, the way that males will also have privilege and oppress others. So just coming back to the spiritual thinking or looking into this time from a spiritual point of view, we are experiencing this collective vulnerability, which I am not a theologian, but I'm an empirical theologian. So this notion of kenosis.
Yeah. Kenosis. Yeah.
Kenosis, yes. That for me has always fascinated me, and I really got into that after I was in Chiapas accompanying communities after the massacre of Actial, and I saw the grace of God coming through and accompany her people that had been surviving, that you survive a massacre. And I saw this grace and strength coming through that pain and suffering and really like vulnerability. That's what seemed to be a weakness. It turned out to be the greatest of the strengths that can actually face with the power of the state. I think we are in one of those moments when this kenosis shows the presence of God among her people facing this brutal state. These scenes we have seen of people standing with someone pointing a gun to their faces. There is a mystery there that can speak to us. And I think that for us, the challenge is how are we gonna let that push us out of the comfort zone and see what things we need to stop ignoring what things we need to start acknowledging. There is a big difference between knowing. We all know the numbers of racial inequality, social inequality, all these indicators of poverty, wealth accumulation. We know that, but we need to acknowledge that and then recognize, which means really change some connections in our brain to see things differently. And from the theological point of view, I think that means also if we heal and regain power and control, is so that we can surrender ourselves to the will of God, which means do justice, love your brother and sister, recognize them as your brothers and sisters as a surrender.
I'm going to jump off of that. Dante, are you leaning in? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, very quickly. I think for this moment that we're in, as we're talking about, the society and societal challenges across various spheres, I think this, in some sense, we have to reimagine how one communicates good news and the good life in this society. So the questions that I have right now, that I'm wrestling with is kind of like James Cone. So the Detroit uprising happened, and Cone is teaching, at this majority white university. And he says, his people was in the street, just like James Baldwin. James Baldwin was I think it was in France. And he was like, man, I couldn't deal with what was happening I couldn't deal with what was happening in America and stay comfortable in France. And so Cone, like Baldwin, said, like Nehemiah, that I got to get out of Babylon, that I must, in some sense, get out of Babylon, go on this courageous journey to venture back to my people, to bring the experience of love, power, justice, and liberation. And so Cone said that he had to learn how to communicate a faith that was, one, accountable to Black people, and two, accountable to their struggle for Black freedom and Black dignity and hope in a society. And so we need to reimagine the language of faith that will really courageously face the question, how does one communicate good news when someone's foot is on your neck and you publicly are executed by a certain type of state power, state sanctioned crucifixion like that of Jesus? How does one communicate a certain type of good news in the face of Black death? How does one communicate faith, and what type of discipline a certain type of faith should be when you are faced with the tragic conditions of oppression? I think for me, I've resonated deeply with Black liberation theology, because this certain type of Black liberation theology has given me a certain type of way of imagining the world that Black people are in the future, and not simply extinguished by this society, but we are, in some sense, the liberators that we have been looking for. We are the perfecters of democracy in connection with progressive and democratic grassroots coalitions of many people from various backgrounds working for a more loving and just world. So we have to reimagine, how does one communicate good news and a good life?
Thank you. I'm gonna I'm realizing I agree with you, Pancho. I wish this could keep going and going. This is Anglo faults. We stick to a clock. But there's a question here. So questions are coming in. Thank you all out there for asking all these questions. We're not going to be able to get, unfortunately, to even probably a quarter of them. But this one from Andrew. Ms. Argüelles quotes defining healing as regaining power and control is provocative. In a society that conceives of power and control in manipulative and domineering terms, how do we build toward truly human understandings of power and control centered in love and authentic solidarity? Pancho, that was addressed to you.
So yes, it's the notion of recovering power and control. I think we need to think it from the perspective on acknowledging that there is millions of people over the world who don't have power and control over their bodies. Women, immigrant workers, people with disabilities who are also pushed out of spaces where there is accessibility and inclusion to them. But even a worker that has to work 3 jobs just to get enough money to eat and survive has no power and control over their own bodies in terms that you just have to sell your labor force, which is essential to this. That's another pernicious idea, is this notion that markers are free. They're not free, they are organized around whoever has the most power. So I think that if we have a wide and deep lens, it has to do with post-colonial or colonial realities, that entire peoples lost power and control over their own bodies, their territories, their theologies, their language, their culture, their overall existence when they were colonized and looted. We want to talk about looting, we need to ask to the masters of looting. That's real looting. This thing is real. That's nothing, man. I'm not saying it's nice or good, but like there is anyway, I'm digressing. Recovering power and control is, again, at the very personal level, is how do you relate to your own emotions, your body, your thoughts, your actions, the capacity to do what you want, to inhabit your own feelings. And there is a relational way to that we build in community. And from a faith perspective, is also how you recover power and control so that you surrender that to your community and your God. One last thing I want to say his name, George Floyd. We don't have the time to say all their names, but I know I didn't say his name. George Floyd is one of the reasons why we feel raw enough to speak truth and maybe making people uncomfortable, but because we're pushed to this time when we just witness a public lynching in slow motion and we can say his name. And recovering power and control is to eliminate the possibility of institutions to cause that kind of pain.
Thank you. So someone asks, this meeting has understandably centered on one facet of societal illness that recent events have apocalypsed. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but namely racial injustice. What other lies or diseases have you seen unveiled in recent events, particularly through the pandemic's onset? I'll open the floor to any one of you. Candace, go ahead. Why don't you, if you have a thought?
I mean, one of the things that's become really clear is the kind of damage we're doing to the environment. I mean, just the sudden shift under lockdowns in air quality, in water quality, in the lives of non-human animals, these kinds of things. So the sort of rot that is part of our wanton destruction of the world that we all share is something that I think has also come to light in a completely different way. Through things like the return of birds, that sort of thing. And the bizarre aspects of a global world, right? Which some people are treating as, look, we're all in the same boat. But we're obviously not all in the same boat. And it's just that we all happen to be vulnerable at the same time to this particular problem without a clear or obvious solution. How it plays out in different places, it's different, of course, massively different. But the sort of lie that we can imagine that we're separate, and that national spaces can be distinctive and isolated spaces with something that goes everywhere is, I think, really powerful. And that if we stop, the earth can exhale for a few minutes, also huge.
Go ahead, Dante.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead, I know we got many questions, so you can just keep going.
Sure. Okay. This is a big one, and I'm looking at the clock here. So actually, maybe a really nice one to you guys to think about is sort of some conclusion, which I realize we barely even put a dent in the pie here. But this person is asking, how does one separate and discern between and search for the true core of good at the heart of this movement from the violence and self-interest? Personally, I have noticed a great deal of fracturing, a sort of us versus them when it comes to recent events. One cannot understand the suffering of Black people in this country if one is not Black, just as non-Jews cannot completely understand the suffering of the Holocaust. But how does one make the most of this from a Christian lens? How can one affirm this movement from a Christian lens?
Okay, I guess I can take a stab at that one.
Go for it.
So, yeah, I think, you know, this is kind of leaning into the previous question regarding what does, you know, we talked about, you know, racial injustice and racial terror and violence, and what does it expose beyond our kind of, you know, this white supremacist logic. And I think this question actually leans into that, you know, and I think that's why it's so important to communicate, you know, Black people's struggle in America as the guiding logic of our social criticism and analysis. Because as I think Kimberly Crenshaw would say, that when one sees Black women, and in particular and Black people in general, one sees these various intersections of the disease the disease soil to which one has to live in. So you see the environmental injustice that's happening. You see the crisis of moral leadership. You see the crisis of public policy to take into account the various lives that Black people live, and creating a world in which, as Pancho would say, a healed world in which dignity, power, and agency in the political, social, and religious and cultural process becomes a guiding reality. And so I think, you know, as we communicate, you know, in this moment, a certain type of good, where is the good, or what is the good life? I think in some sense, you know, we have to take an analysis of, you have to analyze in some sense to communicate the story of, you know, the Bible and reflecting the story that we live today. You know, as Roland Williams would say, you know, who was former Archbishop of Canterbury, he would say, you know, when we enter the Bible, we enter a story. And with those ancient Near East peoples are much like us. And in some sense, you know, their stories are our stories, and our stories and their stories intersect in hopes that a better story may be told. And so as I think about, you know, communicating the good, you know, in this society, particularly as the questioner wondered, I think I look at various stories of, you know, various injustice, and the good is in the protest of evil, the protest of difference. And so, you know, oftentimes, you know, in society, it has been white people's privilege to be able to philosophize the good rather than pursue it. And so we need to even reimagine the question of reimagine, you know, how does one think about the good, of being a philosophy to being actually a practice that one embodies in community. And so, you know, this is kind of leaning back to the language of reimagining faith. So the good is, in some sense, wherever we protest death and are pursuing common life, that is the good. Wherever there is violence and we are pursuing healing and hope, that is the good. Wherever there is a narrative of difference and experience of terror, and we bring truth to power, and we protest that particular narrative and trying to produce a life together, that is the good. And even something as simple as, you know, being aware of the various struggles that we are facing in society is pursuit of the good. And so I don't think, you know, and this might be dangerous language to speak as a theologian in some sense, a theological language. I don't even know if in some sense, you know, the good is the most important question, as much as the good life is the question that we should be pursuing. So I don't know if that helps to, that's just kind of my raw thoughts of thinking about that. Not the good, not as a point to achieve, but a practice to actualize.
A way, yeah, yeah. Well, there is a saying, weigh the truth in the life, and sometimes the way and the life get ignored, right? He embodied. Pancho or Candace, do you want to?
I do want to say that we need to be very intentional with our questions, because yeah, all can be good questions, but I think at this point that there are questions that might be more urgent. Mm-hmm. There is no purity in any movement. There's no purity. We're looking for purity. We're gonna sit back and wait for it. I think there is an urgency for solidarity. Messy, walking together, stepping on each other's toes, making us trip and fall, but walking together. That's at the center of accompaniment that I learned working in Chiapas, Nicaragua, Guatemala, taught by people who were risking their life, and some of whom actually gave their life. Pastoral workers that died during the repression in the 80s, no? Monsignor Romero and many others who gave their lives, not because it was clear. It wasn't because it was clear, but it was because was what their God was demanding of them or us, of walking with the poor, the suffering, and learn and accompany them in that journey, because there is an urgency on solidarity, and solidarity is always intentional. It's never accidental. I might hurt and oppress somebody by accident, but I can only show solidarity with intentionality. And for me, that will be the final thing, is what are we healing from? From this alienation from our own humanity and from our own faith, the way we have allowed to separate our faith, the presence of God in our life, from our political choices, from our actions, from our opinions in social media. We alienate, we separate that. I think we're healing a lot from that in connecting and connecting it to others, and few things more transformative than that solidarity, when we recognize the presence of God in history, in the actions and the grace of those who are suffering and are resisting, with joy, with hope, with power, with rage, and with dignity.
Thank you. Candace, somehow the lady went last on this one, but I'll give you the, you may not, well, go ahead.
I just want to thank Pancho and Dante. It's really, really helpful and powerful. And I agree that the thing we can do is work in solidarity with one another, and it's messy and sloppy, but it's intentional and it's from God. Right? God is in solidarity with all of us. If you want to walk with each other, you got a good model.
Yeah. On that note, I just want to thank each of you, Pancho, Dante, and Candace, for helping me really. I was writing many things down actually in an old, it happens to have a bunch of Bible verses in it, an old devotional that I happen to have on my desk, with just a million questions, really, more than anything, that I really hope that this particular little platform has a chance to explore in ways like this, on the written page and other ways, and hopefully eventually very much off the page. So just thank you for your presence, and we hope to see you again. For all of you out there watching, obviously this is very short to discuss a very raw current moment, as well as the complexities and intricacies of this sort of deeper, shaking of a sense that the world is very much shifting, and we hope you'll come back and check out Breaking Ground. We're going to have it. We just launched an hour ago, as I said. You can find us at www.breakingground.us, and I would just encourage each of you watching to check out Candace and Pancho's and Dante's work there, and their bios there, which they'll sort of trace to the sort of the witness of their lives, writings, and organizations they serve. And now I am going to be a little bit maybe overly earnest, but just want to leave everyone watching with a passage from John O'Donohue, which has been sitting on my desk for some time. It has become very much alive in recent days, and it just goes like this. The Greeks believed that time had a secret structure. There was the moment of epiphany when time suddenly opened and something was revealed in luminous clarity. There was the moment of crisis, or krisis with a K, when time got entangled and directions became confused and contradictory. There is also the moment of kairos. This was the propitious moment. Time opened up in kindness and promise. All energies cohered to offer a fecund occasion of initiative, creativity, and promise. Part of the art of living wisely is to learn to recognize and attend to such profound openings in one's life. And the only thing I would add to that quote is in one's society and times. I hope that in this particularly wild moment of crisis, that there might also be a chance of kairos, that moment in our own lives, in our relationships one to another, in our much broader systems and institutions and habits and sort of cultural norms, as Candace in particular invoked. Reckoning and reimagining, and that you'll come along with us at Breaking Ground to get ideas, to be encouraged, to be challenged, to encounter people and ideas you might not have otherwise, and to resource you and to resource all of us really to dig deep and imagine what could come next. Our trust is that somehow with a bit of providence and a whole lot of collaborative magic, that this unwieldy platform could cohere and convert us into living by a noticeably different narrative on the other side, a narrative founded on a better common life in real time, not just as an idea. And I guess I would just say that I hope and pray that God grants us each grace, each one of you watching, the peace that surpasses understanding, and the hope of God's love still alive, moving through us, revealing and renewing all things. Thank you very much, and good night.